So actually, we've caught up. This is actually where I would like to have been 2 classes ago. So better late than never, I guess. What we're going to look at today is I've talked about what happened after the 1960s, and the reaction to the 1960s was that corporations and capital starts to construct permanent structures of what I called rectification. Okay, so it wasn't going to be that we're going to deal with this thing happens here, this thing happens here, we'll deal with it on a crisis basis. How do we set up a permanent structure? And that permanent structure has been in place for a while, and it can be mobilized, well, at an instant, it can be mobilized pretty quickly. It can be mobilized, actually, I think we saw the end result of a mobilization yesterday. The election yesterday, people are, I mean, there was a number of commentators are kind of posing the question, how could this happen in 2 years? How could the Republican Party go from being the most discredited party there's been for a while after 8 years of the Bush-Cheney disaster, and the upsurge for Obama in 2008, and 2 years later, how could this kind of transformation have taken place? And people are kind of dumbfounded by it. And I actually don't think you need to be dumbfounded. We've actually looked at how it's happened. We've looked at how those conservative foundations went into action even before the election. We haven't really talked about what I think actually is the real incompetence of the Democrats and the Obama administration in the last 2 years for trying to maintain the coalition, that symbolic coalition. Okay, it's not even a real coalition, because there were people in Obama's coalition who had nothing in common with each other except for the idea that this was somehow about progressivism and about change. But they did nothing to construct that. They did nothing to make sure that it was going to stay up. At the same time, you had people like the Kochs and these right-wing foundations launching that campaign. So I actually don't think if you look at it closely, it shouldn't be a wonder to anyone. It's a kind of obvious result of the actions that have taken place. But there was also, I mean, that structure can be mobilized very quickly, and it can be put to use very quickly because it's already there. The basis of it is already there. Not much has to be done. You just have to kind of plug in some various things to it. And that structure, what we're going to look at today is we're going to look at this model conceptualized by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky. How many people have, if you've been in communication, you might have heard of this? How many people have heard of this model before? Okay, not many. Okay, so it hasn't been done at lower levels. It is a kind of, and the authors of it are Ed Herman and Noam Chomsky. Ed Herman is a retired professor of business in the Wharton School of Communication at the University of Pennsylvania, and Noam Chomsky is perhaps the most important individual living today or something. I mean, he's one of the main, in fact, anywhere except for the United States. If you go anywhere else in the United States, other than the United States, if you go to Europe, if you go to Australia, Chomsky is like a rock star. I mean, literally, when he comes to visit, it's a major event, because what you've got visiting is one of the major intellectual voices of the 20th century. Okay, when the history of the 20th century is written, when the intellectual history of the 20th century is written, Chomsky's name will be up there, and it'll be up there in 2 ways. On the one hand, it will be there in the field of linguistics. He revolutionized the study of the field of linguistics. That's his kind of academic background. Not background, that's his academic. And he's a professor at MIT, still teaches in the linguistics department there, still teaches graduate classes. But there is a kind of when it comes to linguistics, there is a pre-Chomsky era and there's a post-Chomsky era. So he's already a major figure in the discipline of linguistics. And then he is, of course, has been for the last 25 years, one of the most consistent, courageous voices for dissent in the United States. Actually, I would say last 50 years, not 25 years. And he's now in his 80s, but still going strong. Still going strong. We actually did, the Media Education Foundation, we're working on a new project. We just did an interview with him a couple of weeks ago. I wasn't there, but the people who interviewed him said he's still, there's nothing that's gone. Which when you're 83 is, I'm hoping I'm just be able to walk at 83, let alone live a productive life. I mean, there is, just as an aside, I mean, there are a number of people are kind of dying now. And the other great giant of American dissent and American history that's died recently has been Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn died, I think it was last year at some point. But again, Zinn and Chomsky, for a lot of people, signify a particular generation of intellectual activists. And they're intellectuals. They're intellectuals and activists at the same time. And I don't think for them, they couldn't actually figure out how you separate those two things. That in fact, one of the functions of being an intellectual actually is to make sure that your idea is to communicate your ideas so that they actually become a force in the society. And that means operating outside of the university. Because within the university, there's a tendency to kind of clamp down on that stuff, but it means operating outside the university. Chomsky has been, he is the model of how to live, not how to only to do analysis, but how to live an intellectual life. How to live an intellectual life. Now, for those, everyone took 287. Did I not play a clip from Chomsky in 287 at the end? No? Actually, I'll make sure I play that. Perhaps I'll play it at the end of 387, actually. Because it's a nice piece for why you need to do active work, why you need to be engaged in the world. And not just because it's good for the world, it's because it's good for you. It's healthy for you to do that. Anyway, this is not the major thing that Chomsky is connected with, but it's one of the theories that he's developed with Edward Herman. And the propaganda model, which is what we're going to do in the next two classes, I'm going to lay out this model. And it's a great model because it's a model that can be tested. It doesn't just say, here's how it is. It's a model that can be tested. It lays out a series of hypotheses. It lays out the model. It says, here is how we think media operate. Here are the structures. And then from this, we would expect this. And you can then test exactly what would happen if you plug something into this model. So it's a model that can be, it's not just a model that is a theoretical model, it's a model that can be tested with evidence. And we will, for the remainder of the semester, test it with evidence and not just take it at face value. The idea of the propaganda model is, and it's a propaganda model of news. It's a propaganda model of the media, of how the media, and of especially how the news media are structured. And the central idea of the model is an idea of filters. That in fact, the news is the end result of a number of filters being applied to information as it goes through. It's like coffee filters. Like a coffee filter holds some things up, holds the beans up, doesn't let everything through, but it lets the flavor through. So filters hold things up and let other things through. And they talk, and Chomsky and Herman and Chomsky, actually there's a reason why this is Herman and Chomsky, because actually, and Chomsky was very insistent it be this way, because if you notice, normally when two people write something and it's equal, then you actually do it alphabetically. So alphabetically, it should be Chomsky and Herman. But actually, Chomsky was very insistent on this, that this is actually mainly Ed Herman's work, and that Herman's name come first on this, and then he'd be identified and recognized for the work that he's did. And so what you're going to be seeing is another film that we worked on, that the Media Education Foundation made. It's actually quite old now. The examples are old. I want to say old, it's 12 years old. The examples are old, although the model still holds. and then we'll plug in new information to it for the rest of the semester to figure out, to test how this to test it. But in the film that we did, we made sure that we interviewed, that we gave Ed Herman a very prominent voice in it as well. Actually, in fact, so let me play you. This is Ed Herman starting off talking about what these filters are. Actually, no, is it? I'm actually not sure who's going to be speaking first.
What the propaganda model tries to do is stipulate a set of institutional, ideological variables that reflect this elite power and that powerfully influence the media.
Herman and Chomsky use the metaphor of filters. There's all this information out there, but only some of it gets through. Now, of course, the use of filters is inevitable. The news has to select and edit information. But that filtering isn't just a question of free journalistic judgment. It's heavily influenced by a series of institutional pressures, such as who owns the media, the role of advertisers, the kinds of sources that are used, and a more direct form of pressure that Herman and Chomsky call flack. Key question in any democracy is what makes it through the filters and what gets filtered out.
You'll recognize Justin Lewis in there as well. He's there was actually three of them. You'll see Justin Lewis, Noam Chomsky, and Ed Herman as the voices in this. But as I say, it's this series of filters. Again, if you take the notion of you have to have filters. Right? The notion of filtering is inevitable. And as soon as you're trying to go from huge amounts of information to what will come out in the media. There's got to be some filtering process. So the question is, what are the filters? Do the filters, are they good filters? Are they bad filters? What do they hold up? What do they let through? What never even makes its way into the filters for it to be held up? And they identify there are, and we'll look at these, there are 5 filters. Okay, the filter of ownership, the filter of advertising, the filter of news makers, the filter of news shapers, and the filter of flack. Again, you don't have to think about these one. It's not like it goes through ownership first, and these filters work together. So these are, they're not actual filters. They're not actual levels of it. They all work together, but they're abstract filters for our mode of thinking. And you can separate them out in this abstract form for us to be able to understand. And remember, that when reality is complicated, you've then got to abstract down. Reality is complicated. Let's get its constituent elements. Let's abstract out, and then we'll put them back together. Okay, that's the work of theory. You start off with complicated things. You've got to then, from that, work out what are the central aspects of this. That's abstraction. And then once you've got that, okay, let's go back to the concrete aspect that we started off from and see if our abstractions, see if our intellectual work helps to explain the complicated reality that we start off with. That's the function of theory. I know theory gets a bad rap a lot of the time. A lot of the time it deserves a bad rap because it's simply trying to confuse things. But theories are necessary. Not in and of themselves, but theories are necessary to try and explain something. And as I think I've constantly said to you, the way to evaluate a theory is not if it's elegant, not if it's clever, the way to evaluate a theory is what does it explain? How well does it explain it? How much of reality does it explain? And that means you have to test theories. That means you have to put them under a microscope and evaluate them, in this case, empirically. Again, I'm not asking people to take anything at face value here. Everything has to be tested. Everything has to be tested with reality, with evidence. If you couldn't do that, if you just had theories, and there was no way there was no way you could evaluate between theories, no evidence, then how would you evaluate between theories? You just have, I mean, it actually becomes just faith. I believe this theory because I believe it. And I believe this theory, I believe this theory because I'm right-wing, I believe this theory because I'm left-wing. And, that's why it's true. It's because I'm conservative or liberal that theories are true. But if that was the case, you wouldn't need to come to university and you wouldn't need to come to a class to figure out. Because you would believe something before you walked in and you believe the same thing as you walked out. That's not, that's not how I evaluate theory. The way to evaluate theory is through evidence. Through evidence. And then you can argue, okay, what constitutes evidence and what is, those are legitimate, legitimate discussions you can have. But it's through evidence. The first filter is, oops, shit, sorry. Is that Floyd? Yeah. All right. See 2 chords and you know what it is. It's the first filter is ownership, as it says here. Well, let me just play the clip. I didn't think I was going to play it, but it suddenly came up.
Now, if you look at the agenda-setting media, what are they? Well, in the first place, they're huge corporations, parts of even bigger corporations like, Westinghouse and so on. So they are subparts of huge concentrations of private power.
We're used to thinking of these huge corporations that run the media as large, faceless entities, but they're actually run by people with opinions and a very specific set of interests. And a few of them might be liberal on some issues that don't affect the bottom line, like abortion. But when it comes to the bulk of issues, they're significantly more conservative than most Americans.
When we talk about media ownership and control, we're talking about the ownership and control by very wealthy people who have interlocking directorships with many other corporations. Now, very often they don't intervene in a gross way, but for example, Lawrence Grossman, who was the president of NBC, in his autobiography mentions that the GE chairman of the board, Jack Welch, pointed to him and said, "Remember, you work for General Electric Corporation." Now, in the case of hands-on owners like Rupert Murdoch, they obviously come in and impose an overall policy on their subsidiaries.
It's in the nature of the media business, regardless of technology, the proprietors can run the show in this way.
When Rupert Murdoch takes over the London Times and the Sun in London and the New York Post, the policies changed markedly. Editors are put in who will meet Rupert Murdoch's conservative biases. In fact, in England, there's another very powerful media entrepreneur named Conrad Black, who controls 50% of the newspapers in Canada, owns about over 100 papers in the United States, including the Chicago Sun-Times. Like Murdoch, he's a very conservative man. Their power is so great that when Tony Blair became head of the Labour Party, he actually went to Australia to visit Murdoch and to try to convince Murdoch that he had proper credentials. And he convinced Murdoch. In the last election, Murdoch actually supported the Labour Party and Tony Blair over the Conservative Party. Part of the reason for that was that, surprisingly enough, the Conservative Party had proposed some limit on a concentration in the British media, and Murdoch was reportedly furious at this. Now, the Labour Party had even a more stringent proposal, but at Blair's insistence it was dropped.
Well, Rupert Murdoch changed his mind. He likes to back a winner, and there's a sort of implicit understanding between Mr. Blair and Mr. Murdoch that since the Murdoch press treated Mr. Blair kindly during the election, Mr. Blair will treat Mr. Murdoch kindly now that he's in power.
So here you have an amazing case of policy imposed, and with such force that great leaders have to come and genuflect to Murdoch.
TCI is the nation's largest cable provider. kind of gatekeeper that decides which channels get carried and which don't get carried. As you can imagine, that makes them a very powerful part of the media system. TCI is owned by a man called John Malone. He gets right-wing channels like the National Empowerment Channel onto his cable system, but he can and does keep out any left-wing equivalent.
One thing that's always interested me is how the conservative critics of the media, who allege that the media are liberal, have a tendency to ignore ownership. They sort of pretend that the media are controlled by Dan Rather and Peter Jennings and these people down at the bottom of the power hierarchy in the media.
We're entering the new millennium with just a few huge companies, Time Warner, ABC Disney, Murdoch's News International, Viacom, that own not just the news media, but the entire culture, from record labels to magazines to film studios to cable TV stations. We've seen a massive concentration of power in other industries too, but with media, the dangers of that narrowing are much more troubling.
Again, it'll be the first, this is the question number one with follow the money. Who owns? Who controls? And again, it's not as though they're there every day saying do this, do that, but what owners do is owners can put into place key personnel, like editors, and they put into place people who will run the show for them, people who match their own agendas, and these people always have to have very specific agendas. And sometimes it's one owner, but oftentimes, you know, these are giant corporations with many different owners. Rupert Murdoch is he's kind of become the poster child for, for what bad owners can do. But he's arguably the most powerful man in the world. Why? He's much more powerful than Obama, who's supposed to be the president because Murdoch's empire spreads across the world, and it's an information empire. It's an information empire, and he controls, huge amounts of media outlets. The Fox News network is just the most obvious part of what he controls. Again, most of these owners have very specific ideological agendas and ideological positions. Murdoch, as we know, just recently gave $1 million to the Republican Party just before this last election as a contribution from News International. How does ownership lead to control? So people who own the media, but the question that we should always ask is how does that ownership, because someone might say, so a journalist who was here might say, oh yeah, but I work for News International, and I have total freedom. I can do whatever I can do whatever I want. I'm not a pawn of Rupert Murdoch. Actually, I think he'd be highly deluded if he was to say that. But interesting question. But a lot of journalists actually believe they're free, and the reason they believe they're free is because they've narrowed what they think the bounds of their activities are. And so they say, well, once you've said that in your own mind, okay, I'm free, I can do this or that, and no one's telling me, then you've censored yourself. And you censor yourself by internalizing the structure. And if you want to make your way up, if you want to be successful in journalism, you've got to understand the structure. And you've got to internalize that structure. And most of the kind of really good journalists, I just heard someone last week, a very good independent journalist, who is a freelancer, and he works also for some of these companies as a freelancer. He says it's interesting that some of the most interesting work the journalists do is when they first get into the business, when there's not a lot at stake. And then the higher and higher you go, the more important the job becomes, the more limited you become in terms of what you will be doing. Because the closer you get, the higher you go up, the closer you are to owners, the closer you are to where power is concentrated, and the more you have to understand what the structure is if you want to survive at that level. And you can delude yourself by saying, actually, I'm free. because you've internalized the structure. But how does ownership lead to control? I mean, if we were to look at it, again, we could spend a long time looking at this in terms of the details of it, but in general, every company, every corporation, again, Rupert Murdoch doesn't have, Rupert Murdoch he owns, part of News International. He doesn't own all of it. There are lots of other shareholders of News International as well, but he's a very important member of it, important component of it. But every corporation, it's actually quite simple. Every corporation runs through a board of directors. The board of directors represents the shareholders. Right? The question then is, who is on the boards of directors? And again, you can trace this through, and people have done it, which is, okay, who's on the board of directors of News International? Who's on the board of directors of Viacom? Who's on the board of well, if you look at that, if you look, who's on the board of directors of the New York Times? You can do it quite, this is not an app, this is not some abstraction. You can do it quite concretely. And then you say, well, who are these people connected to? If you look at the board of the New York Times, for example, who is on the board of the New York Times, and what institutions, what interests do they represent there? Because they have been appointed to the board to represent particular kinds of interests. And those directors are closely tied to corporations. Shouldn't surprise us at all, right? They're closely tied to, and because you have to make sure it's not just the profitability of this news organization that you're involved in, but it also is a broader concern with corporate interests as well. And so the people who make policies at these media companies are already they are already connected to a very particular form of power, which is corporate power. And it wouldn't surprise you then that what do these boards of directors do? They're the ones that choose who editors are. They're the ones who choose who managers are. They're the ones, it wouldn't surprise you then that they choose people who reflect both their own agendas and the agendas they represent and the agendas of the organization that they're a part of. That shouldn't surprise anyone. If we had time, we could do that analysis so we could see where things were connected. It's also, there's a very interesting set of, there's also a body of research on what's called interlocking directorships. If you really want to trace through where the interests lie, because okay, let's say I'm on the board of the New York Times. Okay, you can look me up, and you will find that a large number of people who are on the boards of one company are also on the boards of another company. And so in fact, I may be, not only would I be a member of the New York Times, I'd be a board member perhaps of some pharmaceutical company. I might be a board member of some insurance company. And those are called interlocking directorships. And you can just say, okay, just based on those formal things, where is, if you look at the New York Times, where are the interlocking directorships? What other organizations are represented on the New York Times? Because if I'm a director of the New York Times, but I'm also a director at the same time of a pharmaceutical industry, a pharmaceutical company, I'm actually representing in that moment as one person. I'm representing both, because I'm the director there, I'm the director here. And if I'm a director, you can trade, and if you wanted to try and trade, if you wanted to see where the influences lie, it wouldn't. You wouldn't be surprised at the direction. And again, the interlocking directorships are not towards liberal, non-profit, charitable foundations, or towards the interlocking directorships are along the lines we would absolutely expect, which is towards elite power and towards corporate power as well. So that's one way. That's ownership, and less more. I mean, the last 20 years we've seen more and more what's called concentration of ownership. There is fewer and fewer companies owning more and more media outlets. So there's actually very, very few what you can call independent voices in the mainstream media. In fact, almost everything in the mainstream media is owned by about 6 companies. Very, very narrow. And they all have the same interest. Doesn't really matter what those. They're not as. It's not as though one company is really left wing, another company is right wing. They're all in. They're all in the business of making money on this. But very, very narrow control. There's also been. There's actually a very interesting book that just came out a couple of years ago by. These are 2 conservatives. Okay, Richard Viguerie and David Frankel. They're 2 conservatives, and they wrote this book saying, here's how we did it. And the book is called America's Right Turn, How Conservative Media Use New and Alternative Media to Take Power. And they're very proud of it. I mean, they're not trying to hide it. This is how we did it. This is how we shifted. This is how we made conservative ideas normal. This is how we made pro-corporate ideas normal. This is how we get poor people who don't have health care saying, get your hands off my health care, get your hands off my corporate health care. This is how you can, that's how you can, and they argue, they say on the one hand they created explicitly conservative media. Okay, the mainstream, I mean, you talk about the mainstream media and, NBC, and that actually, I want to make sure I don't fall into this, because sometimes the focus on Fox as the kind of, as the evil, agent takes attention, it somehow takes attention away from, ABC and NBC and CBS and all these other, but in fact, Fox is not that different. It is different in terms of its emphasis. But it doesn't mean that the rest of the media system is free in any way. The rest of the media system, in one sense, may be even more dangerous because the focus is on Fox, and you somehow think, well, these other stations must be, there's more freedom there. And sometimes, the freedom is, it's interesting. I showed those clips from Rachel Maddow the other day, and she's on MSNBC. She has a show on MSNBC. And one of the reasons is she's really good at getting ratings. She's really good on radio, and she's really good on television, and people watch her. But MSNBC, in one sense, has been able to carve out a little place for itself and get an audience and get ratings by being the antidote to Fox. And so there are business decisions you can make here to try and get audiences. Okay, how do we get liberal audiences and how do we get their eyeballs to sell to advertisers? Well, sometimes there is a space there, small space, for people like Rachel Maddow to be able to get in. So it's not as though it's a closed off system, totally closed off system. It's closed off in the sense that it is about money and it is about advertising. We'll come to that in a second. But how that can be kind of operationalized or manifested in a number of different ways. Okay, but that's the mainstream media. In addition to that, what Richard Viguerie and David Frankel said, we created a right-wing media. Okay, I mean, there's the mainstream, and the first thing they created, or the first thing they took over, was talk radio. So talk radio today, epitomized by Rush Limbaugh, is almost entirely conservative. And it was and talk radio, was one of the major pushers of the Tea Party movement. Again, talk radio used to exist, wasn't very big. They transformed that form and said we can make this into something different. I sometimes recommend people listen to talk radio, but it's actually not very good for your health listening to it, especially for your blood pressure. Listening to it, especially if you don't have a lot of sympathy for. I'm not even going to say it. It's not very healthy if you're at all intelligent. The other thing they created was Fox. And Fox is a creation of the last 20 years. Actually, I think Fox is less than that. Was part of this. This is this conservatives and the right and corporations, what did they learnt the lesson of Confucius. This is the lesson of Confucius. If you learn the lesson of Confucius, this is what you would do. And they decided to do it. They said, actually, we're going to do it not piecemeal. We're going to do it in this kind of systematic way, and to set up a structure that's already there. So you don't have to, it's not about reacting here or there. It's about having this structure that everything kind of has to flow through. In this first filter, the first filter of ownership. Okay, the second filter. Okay, so who controls, sets policies, that's really set. That's the first filter. Trying to get a message through that doesn't jive with that agenda, that filter will cut it out right from the start. Okay, the second filter we've looked at already. We spent the first 5 classes actually this semester looking at that first filter, which is the filter of advertising.
Another important filter is advertising. As they say, he who pays the piper calls the tune. In a commercial media system, the person who pays is the advertiser. Magazines get about 50% of their revenue from advertising, press gets about 80%, and with radio and TV, it's pretty much close to 100%. If you run a news organisation, these are people you can't afford to offend.
Like other corporations, they sell a product to a market. In their case, the market is advertisers, other businesses. The product is audiences. Well, if you just look at the basic institutional structure of that system, and a rational person will ask, what kind of news and interpretation is going to come out of this? Well, the picture of the world that's going to come out is going to be one that's supportive to the needs and interests of the sellers, the buyers.
In its impact on the media, advertisers affect them mainly by wanting a proper environment. They don't intervene directly too often, but mainly they tell the media what they want. The media are in fact soliciting them. They know what they want, so there's a constant interplay. But sometimes programs are produced that they don't like ex post, and they come along and they complain. In the case, for example, this little newspaper had an article on automobile buying and said that this is a seller's market, and the new car dealers are asking for a 7.5% profit margin, but if you're smart and bargain with them, you can get it down to half that. And the auto dealers in the area were furious, and they raised Cain, they complained, they started an advertising boycott, and the publisher, this little newspaper, issued a public apology and said they were all wrong. One station manager of a TV station in Boston was quoted a year or so ago saying that since auto advertisements are about 25% of local advertising, it is an unwritten rule that you will never discuss buying autos and make any critique of the process of buying autos. It's an unwritten rule.
The Chrysler company, for example, they sent out a letter to the magazines they advertise in. Chrysler's a big company, so that's a lot of magazines. And that letter insisted that they send their articles to Chrysler in advance so that they could screen them in order to see if they were suitable. If they didn't like the articles, they'd pull the ads. It's what we might call corporate censorship.
Some of the prime advertisers actually have a powerful influence on public broadcasting too, because in the desire to curb public broadcasting, to keep it within proper bounds, conservatives have kept its funding in short supply. During the Reagan years, there was a very sharp cutback of funding for PBS and a real attempt to push them into the commercial nexus. So who comes into the picture to fund PBS? Well, the advertising community.
Welcome to Mobile Masterpiece Theatre. For nearly 30 years, we've been proud to provide the energy that helps public television run.
What has happened over the years in PBS is that their regular public affairs programs have become very conservative dominated, and it's partly because there's money there that will fund those programs. General Electric, which has its own network, funds the McLaughlin show, which is on every week, and Tony Brown, a black Republican who's on every week. So that even on PBS, which is supposed to be the focal point of liberalism, conservatives dominate. One could argue that the evolution of the American television system is really a case study in the evolution of what happens when you have advertising dominating a media system.
Too much time on this, but as Chomsky says, I mean, says if just a rational person looked at this system, would you be surprised that what comes out as content reflects the interests of the owners, corporations, and the buyers of the commodity, advertisers? Remember, we're not the customers. We're the product. And so it will reflect the interests of the buyers and the sellers. And as Ed Herman says there, it's a beautiful system. Actually, it's a very elegant system of control. And it's what, I mean, when we looked at it in part one, it's what Matthew McAllister called allocative control. You're controlling the environment as a whole. And it's not about making this, individual decisions. You're controlling the environment as a whole through your funding sources. As I said, if you're a reporter within this, structure, if you're a smart reporter, you don't need direct orders. You don't need direct orders. You actually, you think that's the world you live in. You internalize exactly what is needed at that time. And that's actually what Chomsky sometimes says. He says, when you look at, for example, really closed societies and look at the risks that reporters take to get their story out. For example, in the old Soviet Union, actually in the present Russia, for a journalist to really do their work, to talk about the corruption that's going on in Russia right now. I mean, literally what happens if you do that in Russia, you get killed. The gangsters, either the government gangsters or the private gangsters, they kill you because if you're a journalist in really close societies, there is a real cost to be paid. And therefore, you've got to be careful how you do your work. You've got to be careful how you live your life. You've got to be careful that you're safe as you do your work. And sometimes that's not enough. What's going to happen to a reporter in this country? What's going to happen to a News International Fox reporter who was to suddenly, was to do a different story, or to New York Times? They're not going to get killed. They'll get fired, possibly, but that's, And then it's amazing, and Chomsky says it's amazing how even that low level of possible impact is enough to keep people under control. You don't even have to threaten them with death. You don't have to threaten them with very much. You just have to threaten. They say you have to in this system. You just have to, you have to get people who internalize these set of values, and they won't go out of it. And they know that if they do, they will not get a raise. They will get a nasty call from their editor. They will possibly lose their jobs. As I said, when it comes to the stakes, they're not very high stakes compared to what journalists in many, many parts of the world do. And Chomsky's at that point, it's even more amazing how little diversity there is in reporting. Again, but then he wouldn't be surprised because the structure chooses people to be in those positions who already hold those kinds of values. The third filter. Okay, so the first two I had to do, because it's important. But I presume that I haven't told you something you don't know already. The rest of the analysis, actually, as I think, actually, perhaps even more interesting. The next filter is what he called newsmakers.
Another important filter is sourcing. The media depend on a steady stream of news, and they come to rely on powerful sources who can give them this regular news. The media locate reporters with regular beats to these primary news sources.
David Martin, CBS News, the Pentagon. Bob Schieffer, CBS News at the Capitol.
John Donvan, ABC News at the White House.
If there's some source that gives out news every day or regularly, and this source is credible so that you can offer the news without worrying about whether it's going to be even true or false, that's very economical.
Okay. For those of you who, if you watch the news, one thing you can, if you want to see this in operation, just see where the news comes from. There is someone at the State Department, someone at the Department, someone at the Pentagon, someone at the White House. Those are the places that have been identified as where news comes from. And so if you limit the places where news comes from to these places that are dominated by the powerful, then by definition, what will get reported is what the powerful want to get reported as news. And if you don't have, if you have a business reporter, I mean, it's a, open up a business, open up the New York Times, right? And you go through, and there's a business section there. Well, so okay, you're gonna report things from Wall Street. What if there was a labor section, where what was reported was things about labor, about what the vast majority of the population do, which is work for a living, not invest for a living, but work for a living? You would actually have a very different set of stories. But it becomes, New York Times. What's it? It's about the news. It's about sports. It's about fashion. It's about business. That becomes the definition of news. If you can narrow the range. Okay, and sometimes I'm just not sure if reporters are just. I don't know if they're lazy, if they're dumb, they really think, I really, it's because it's, or if they really know what they're doing and they do it anyway, right? That they're evil at that point. You know what you're doing and you lie. I'm never quite sure which one of those whether the reporters do. Like I could be more nasty, but I'm not going to say where I tend towards. But you can see it. Just watch the news. Okay, watch the news and see where people are, literally where people are, and what is considered as news. The places that are considered as news. Now, I saw this I'm going to play a clip right now. It's a very revealing clip, and it's actually from the best news show on television. Anyone know what it is? The Daily Show. And it is kind of pathetic that, and Jon Stewart says himself, that a comedy show should be the antidote to, should be the place that actually does the work of journalism. I mean, this, the rally that just took place, 2 comedians leading a rally, and that's the state we've come to now. But the Daily Show, in one sense, is, I think, actually in its limited way, because its number one function is not to analyze. Its number one function is to be funny. And if you can then do other things within that, it can. Actually, I think Jon Stewart's pretty good, and it's very broad. I think the real comedic genius of political comedy is Colbert. He is just unbelievably smart and sharp and quick, and actually gets to the core of things very, very quickly, and very brave as well, I think, in terms of what he does. One of the best things that he did was he was called upon to give a speech at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. So all these reporters who work who have the White House as their beat, and George Bush is there, and so they obviously didn't do their research very well. I mean, that's sometimes when I think about these people are really smart and they know how to run the world, they don't. They don't even know what Colbert is going to do. come to this, and Colbert remained in character, in his Bill O'Reilly character, and delivered this perfect speech about, about how the White House controls mainstream media. And he did it in a way that he thought was good. But it was a perfect communication. Journalists were not happy. They were not very happy at what was happening. But that took some guts, for Colbert to go into the White House and with all these correspondence to do what he does. Anyway, that's by the by. I'm going to show you a clip from the Daily Show, and it's an interview with Wolf Blitzer. Okay, Wolf Blitzer is one of the major, I'll put it in quotation marks, journalists who works for CNN, and Jon Stewart. And what Jon Stewart asks him, and this is from a couple of years ago now, but what he asks him, and we'll look at when you start watching Hijacking Catastrophe, it's the question that comes up over and over again when you ask the question about the Iraq War and about what the reasons were that were given for the Iraq War. The major reason that was given for the Iraq War, number one reason, Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. He had weapons of mass destruction and was a danger to the United States. That was why he had to attack. That was the major propaganda reason that was given. Okay? Turns out, of course, wasn't true. Turns out that Saddam Hussein never had weapons of mass destruction. Actually, he may have had them at one time, but he destroyed them quite a long time ago. And the ones that he had were biological weapons given to him by the United States, but he got rid of them. So the question is, so there is this war that literally has literally cost 1 million Iraqi lives, has literally bankrupted the economy of the United States, that was justified on a total lie. And they knew it was a lie. All this stuff about, our intelligence people, said that if they really thought that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, you think they would have gone in the way they did? If there was a real chance that weapons of mass destruction would be used against people going in? That's why a lot of people around the world now say, actually, our best chance of avoiding being invaded by the United States is actually developing weapons of mass destruction. Is actually having a weapon that actually may be, and so that's why, North Korea, that's why Iran, that's the lesson you learned from the invasion of Iraq. But the question is, how did this happen? Because it was media, right? This was the major idea that was sold through the media. The Saddam Hussein is connected to 9/11. That was a secondary reason. That wasn't the main reason. It was a kind of secondary reason. Once let's put that on here as well. Actually, and I'm actually firmly of the opinion that second reason that Saddam was connected to 9/11. I think actually that was really important as an ideological message for U.S. soldiers. So for soldiers who are there, who are doing the dirty work, there's a reason why they have to put their lives on the line. They're not going to put their lives on the line for weapons of mass destruction that don't exist, or the real reason, which is control of resources and control of the region. You've got to give them another reason. And the other reason is we're going to make sure 9/11 doesn't happen again. And Saddam was, that's the other lie that was told. But this is one, so Jon Stewart, in this interview, I'm setting up Jon Stewart asks, he goes to Wolf Blitzer, come on, what happened? Why did the media, why was this why did you believe the weapons of mass destruction? Why is that what you told us? And it wasn't just Wolf Blitzer, it was the entire media, led by the New York Times. Led by the New York Times, as well as Fox. How did this, right, it's very interesting, and so listen to Blitzer's argument carefully.
We should have been more skeptical. But Come on, it was a...
You know, we're trained to be skeptical by our very nature. That's what
Why
journalists...
weren't you? Because people...
I think we could have been more skeptical. I think we... Look,
Are they afraid of the Bush administration? Is the Bush administration so ham-handed that ham-handed, and this is coming from a Jew who knows nothing of ham, but are they so forceful that they have intimidated the press corps into not asking those questions?
No. The answer is no.
So is the press corps, and again, I'm going to use your word, suffering from groupthink? or another word, retardation. Or which, no, come on. Tell me the truth. I want to know. I'm really curious. I'm baffled.
It's groupthink, not retardation.
It is groupthink.
Groupthink. You know, when you're told repeatedly, and I was told by going into the war. I went off to the war. I went off to Kuwait. You probably remember.
I do remember seeing you in Kuwait City.
So I remember going off. I had all the briefings. I went over. I got the briefings from the CIA, the Pentagon.
Right.
Spoke to all the members of Congress, the intelligence committees, the House side, the Senate side. Everybody said the same thing. There is no doubt there are stockpiles of chemical and biological weapons, and it's only a matter of time before he has a nuclear bomb. Remember, Condoleezza Rice said on my show, Late Edition with Wolf Blitzer. Did you mention that? She said, we can't wait for a smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud. You remember that?
You're exactly right. And as it turns out, Pakistan had already sold mushroom cloud material to every country in the area but Iraq. It's crazy. The whole thing's crazy. Woo! Woo!
What does Wolf Blitzer say? Says, everyone said they had weapons. I went to the briefings of the Pentagon. I went to the briefings of the White House. I went to the briefings of the State Department. I was in on all this. Everyone told me that they. Everyone, right? And in his words, everyone. Actually, that's not true. Because at the time when that was going on, there were lots of people saying, no, there is no evidence. And if there was evidence, let the weapons inspectors do their work. The major weapons inspector, UN weapons inspector for Iraq, Hans Blix, said, we have found no evidence so far, but we couldn't look further. Scott Ritter, who was a US Marine, who worked as a weapons inspector, said they do not have weapons of mass destruction. So when Wolf Blitzer says, everyone said they had it. Well, in his little world, everyone meant the people he spoke to. Everyone meant the people that had been defined as having authority. The State Department, the Pentagon, the White House, Congress. When that's your narrow range of everyone, and you don't look outside of that, well, that narrow range is controlled by very specific interests, and who want to narrow the conversation. Well, then you will. This is okay. So, if you're a journalist, if you're Wolf Blitzer, are you just deluded? Or are you just lazy? Or have you internalized it so much, internalized the structure so much, that you literally don't think that anyone outside of this narrow sphere of elite sources can tell you anything? That actually everyone else is dumb, that all those other people who around the world, not just here, but other people around the world, telling you that there are no weapons of mass destruction, they just don't count. I mean, I can't get inside, I'm not sure I want to be inside Wolf Blitzer's head, but I'm not sure which one of those, but this is the strut. And it's amazing, that question, it's the first time I've heard that question. Actually, the only other person who's really posed it is Bill Moyers, who posed the question of, because it's a massive failure. If journalism is supposed to be about the truth, if journalism is supposed to be the check on power, which is what, that's always told about journalism and journalism schools, we're the ones who, if it was that, it is a massive, the Iraq War and the lead up to the Iraq War and the understandings of the American population leading up to the Iraq War, that is a massive, massive failure of journalism. Or it is exactly how the structure of the system is supposed to operate. You can look at it either way. I mean, for me, it's not a surprise. You look at you have this structure set up as a structure of information, whereby what counts as news is determined, is governed by what journalists think the powerful say. Then what the powerful say will become news, will become reality. And if you can control it, that's why that first, if you can become a news maker, if you can become a news maker, actually it happens at all kinds of levels. It happens at the local level as well. You open up the newspaper. In one sense, it's inevitable, right? If you want to do journalism on a kind of regular basis, you have to have some structure set up, and so you have to have some places where you think news will happen. So you open up, the Daily Hampshire Gazette, once or twice a week. There's a police log there, and it tells you what happened. It tells you what happened with, what the police, who they arrested. It's actually really interesting reading. I always read it. It's always, there's nothing very important stuff that goes on there. People arrested for for being drunk on the street, or actually, I take that back, or domestic violence, or that's where it's reported. Actually, a few years ago, that's a while ago, it's actually quite a while. I was involved in a very small car accident. I was in Northampton, which is where I live. I kind of bumped into the back of someone. And there was very little damage. There was no damage to my car, and but the police were called, and there was a ticket that was issued. And a couple of days later, someone, and I didn't mention to him because it wasn't even that important enough. But a couple of days later, someone said, "Oh, how did that? I heard you were in an accident. How are you?" I said, "How would you know that?" And they said, "I read it in the newspaper." How did they know it in the newspaper? It was in the police log. So I made my way, that little incident, and there are hundreds of incidents that happen every day in a community. Some incidents make their way into the structure of news, and therefore, because of that, become news. Something else that happened that didn't make its way in, which may be just as important, doesn't become news. So that's the way you can structure, there is a city hall beat at the local level, because city hall is, and some of these things, there always has to be some structure. There's always got to be a structure. You can't just have willy-nilly, going to find news where you've got to have, if you're going to working on a daily basis, you've got to, but the question is, what is a decent structure to reflect the diversity of reality, not the narrowness of reality? And if you looked at the mainstream media, I don't think you'd find much diversity either. Of course, we've looked at, the other thing that's happened that's made these news sources much more, the news makers much more important, there's been a radical cut in the number of journalists who do their work, number of journalists that are employed. As concentration has happened, so you literally have just less people, less journalists who are involved in the business of producing news. And when you have less people, but you've still got to do the same, they become reliant upon structures that will make it easier for them to do their work. So the less there is of them, the more pressure there is, the more they are reliant upon people providing information to them. That's the basis of, in the film Toxic Sludge is Good For You, we looked at video news releases. That's the basis of video news releases. Someone's provided all this really, really glitzy footage and visuals already, and you just got to put a few stories on, you can voice over yourself. Well, where do those video news releases come? Well, they come from very particular places within the economy. And so the powerful, in that sense, can subsidize. Once you know the reporters are under real trouble, under real pressure, you can subsidize the news by making it easy, by providing what counts as news. There is an alternative. I mean, Wolf Blitzer. For him, Wolf, he says, actually, he's not alone. Just recently, in fact, in the last couple of months, there's a really good non-profit organization, a media watchdog group called FAIR, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. I highly recommend them to you. They're an excellent research source for looking at media. And they did a report on PBS. Okay, there's no point doing it. I mean, they still do reports on mainstream media, but you know what you're going to find there. But supposedly PBS is supposed to be the alternative, right? NewsHour with Jim Lehrer on, it's supposed to be the alternative, the thinking man, the thinking person's, news. And so they did this story on PBS and found, lo and behold, that in fact they use exactly the same people, exactly the same sources. Actually, Justin Lewis used to say, I mean, I sometimes steal this line from him, he said, PBS is just the same as mainstream media. This is more boring because they're on for longer doing the same stuff. They think they're being in-depth, they're just boring. Because it's in fact the same people speaking. Instead of speaking in a soundbite on NBC, the same person from the White House will be on for a 10-minute interview on PBS. But there was a story, so they did the story on PBS, and essentially said, look, actually, the NewsHour, which is supposed to be the place that there's supposed to be some diversity, in fact, is exactly the same as the rest of the corporate sector in terms of who it allows to speak. And it was a very interesting response from it is solid research. You can't say, oh, they got it wrong. It was, okay, yes, this is who appears. And the spokesperson for the NewsHour essentially said, look, she kind of threw her hands up and said, look, these are the people who make the news. That's why we put them on. That is, these people are the ones who make decisions, and therefore we have to be the vehicle to allow them to voice those decisions. Okay, that's not the definition of news. Actually, it's not my definition of news. It actually is the definition of news and journalism for mainstream media. There is another. The independent journalist Amy Goodman. Again, people sometimes ask me what I listen to, or there is no one place that will give you the truth. But Democracy Now! This is Amy Goodman's daily show. You find it on the web, democracynow.org. Is an antidote. If you want to read the New York Times, watch something else as well. Watch Amy Goodman, and you will see things reported. You will see stories reported. You will see issues raised that just will not be raised. You will see people speaking. You will see types of people speaking that will never make their way onto mainstream media. And what Amy Goodman argues, she says, if you take the notion that journalism is independent, if you take seriously the notion of journalism as a check to elite power, that's why all these journalism schools teach, right? Journalism is this vocation. It's about seeking the truth. It's about not kowtowing to power, and and she says, if that's the case, then what you need to do then journalism actually, you should go to what does Wolf Blitzer go? Wolf Blitzer goes to where the voices are. He goes to the people that speak the loudest. He goes to the people that make it easy he goes to and the role of journalism says, this is an alternative I wouldn't say an alternative, this is a different vision of what journalism should be. The role of journalism is to go to where the silences are. Where the silences are. And people, the issues that we do not see, that do not make their way into the mainstream media. The people who are voiceless in mainstream media. The issues that are submerged in mainstream media. The reason why? Well, because mainstream media is too tied up with the interests of those who have power. It has become a megaphone for those people who have power. Some people say, the role of mainstream journalists is, they've essentially become stenographers to power. A stenographer is in a court, they just write down whatever's said. No comment, just write down whatever's said. Record it. And journalists, one kind of vision of journalism is that's what you do. You just report what people say. If you do, well, then you're going to where the greatest noise is, and you will get, surprise, surprise, you will get the views of the people who make the most noise. And the way you make the most noise is by spending the most money. The way you make the most noise is by setting up those structures to make the role of journalism easier. Independent journalism is a wonderful vocation. The idea of journalism is, I can't imagine a more worthwhile thing to do. The practice of it, well, that's another thing. The structures that are being set up, in one sense, you've got to set up these structures to control it, because in fact, real independent journalism is dangerous. Therefore, you've got to control it. Those are the permanent structures of rectification that have been set up. So ownership, advertising, and you set up these structures of what counts as news, who counts as news, so that literally, right, Wolf Blitzer can go on and he can say with a straight face, literally say with a straight face, not even really embarrassed about it, right? He says, oh, we should have been a little bit more skeptical, but not like it wasn't our fault. Everyone told us. Everyone told. He doesn't even, right? This is his delusion. Is he really believes when he says everyone, he really believes it was everyone, because he doesn't think the world exists outside of those people. He doesn't think the world exists outside of the places where elites talk. It doesn't exist in the places where normal people speak. And if you can convince a journalist to do that, you don't need to have an editor on the end of the phone telling him, do this, do this. You don't have to have the owners. You've got journalists themselves internalizing this structure and thinking they are free. And I've no doubt that Wolf Blitzer thinks he is free, thinks he is independent. Okay, we'll look at the other filters next time. We looked at how it's happened. We've looked at how those conservative foundations went into action even before the election. We haven't really talked about what I think actually is the real incompetence of the Democrats and the Obama administration in the last 2 years for trying to maintain the coalition, that symbolic coalition. Okay, it's not even a real coalition, because there were people in Obama's coalition who had nothing in common with each other except for the idea that this was somehow about progressivism and about change. But they did nothing to construct that. They did nothing to make sure that it was going to stay up. At the same time, you had people like the Kochs and these right-wing foundations launching that campaign. So I actually don't think it's, if you look at it closely, it shouldn't be a wonder to anyone. It's a kind of a obvious result of the actions that have taken place. But there was also, I mean, you know, that structure can be mobilized very quickly, and it can be put to use very quickly because it's already there. It's all, the basis of it is already there. Not much has to be done. You just have to kind of plug in some various things to it. And that structure, what we're going to look at today is we're going to look at this model. When it comes to linguistics, there is a pre-Chomsky era and there's a post-Chomsky era. So he's already a major figure in the discipline of linguistics. And then he is, of course, has been for the last 25 years, one of the most consistent, courageous voices for dissent in the United States. Actually, I would say last 25, last 50 years, not 25 years. And he's now in his 80s, but still going strong. Still going strong. We actually did, the Media Education Foundation, we're working on a new project. We just did an interview with him a couple of weeks ago. I wasn't there, but the people who interviewed him said he's still, there's nothing that's gone. Which when you're 83 is, I'm hoping I'm just be able to walk at 83, let alone live a productive life. I mean, there is, just as an aside, I mean, there are a number of people are kind of dying now. And the other great giant of American dissent and American history that's died recently has been Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn died, I think it was last year at some point. But again, Zinn and Chomsky, for a lot of people, signify a particular generation of intellectual activists. And they're intellectuals, they're intellectuals and activists at the same time. And I don't think for them, they couldn't actually figure out how you separate those two things. That in fact, it conceptualized by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky. How many people have, if you've been in communication, you might have heard of this? How many people have heard of this model before? Okay, not many. Okay, so it hasn't been done at lower levels. It is a kind of, and you know, the authors of it are Ed Herman and Noam Chomsky. Ed Herman is a retired professor of business in the Wharton School of Communication at the University of Pennsylvania, and Noam Chomsky is perhaps the most important individual living today or something. I mean, he's one of the main, in fact, anywhere except for the United States. If you go anywhere else in the United States, other than the United States, if you go to Europe, if you go to Australia, Chomsky is like a rock star. I mean, literally, when he comes to visit, it's a major event, because what you've got visiting is one of the major intellectual voices of the 20th century. Okay, when the history of the 20th century is written, Chomsky, when the intellectual history of the 20th century is written, Chomsky's name will be up there, and it'll be up there in two ways. On the one hand, it will be there in the field of linguistics. He revolutionized the study of the field of linguistics. That's his kind of academic background. Not background, that's his academic. And he's a professor at MIT, still teaches in the linguistics department there, still teaches graduate classes. But there is a kind of so actually we've caught up. This is actually where I would like to have been 2 classes ago. So better late than never, I guess. What we're going to look at today is I've talked about what happened after the 1960s, and the reaction to the 1960s was that corporations and capital starts to construct permanent structures of what I called rectification. Okay, so it wasn't going to be that we're going to deal with this thing happens here, this thing happens here. We'll deal with it on a crisis basis. How do we set up a permanent structure? And that permanent structure has been in place for a while, and it can be mobilized. Well, at an instant, it can be mobilized pretty quickly. It can be mobilized, actually, I think we saw the end result of a mobilization yesterday. The election yesterday, people are, I mean, there was a number of commentators are kind of posing the question, how could this happen in 2 years? How could the Republican Party go from being the most discredited party there's been for a while after 8 years of the Bush-Cheney disaster and the upsurge for Obama in 2008. And 2 years later, how could this kind of transformation have taken place? And people are kind of, dumbfounded by it. And I actually don't think you need to be dumbfounded. We've actually, functions of being an intellectual actually is to make sure that your idea, is to communicate your ideas so that they actually become a force in the society. And that means operating outside of the university. Because within the university, there's a tendency to kind of clamp down on that stuff, but it means operating outside the university. Chomsky has been, he is the model of how to live, not how to only to do analysis, but how to live an intellectual life. How to live an intellectual life. Now, for those, everyone took 287. Did I not play a clip from Chomsky in 287 at the end? No? Actually, I'll make sure I play that. Perhaps I'll play it at the end of 387, actually, because it's a nice piece for why you need to do active work, why you need to be engaged in the world, and not just because it's good for the world, it's because it's good for you. It's healthy for you to do that. Anyway, this is not the major thing that Chomsky is connected with, but it's one of the theories that he's developed with Edward Herman. And the propaganda model, which is what we're going to do in the next two classes, I'm going to lay out this model. And it's a great model because it's a model that can be tested. It doesn't just say, here's how it is. It's a model that can be tested. It lays out a series of hypotheses. It lays out the model. It says, here is how we think media operate. Here are the structures.